do people stay on top of their nutrition? What do they do? What shouldn't they do? What not to do?
You certainly shouldn't be eating like you're in your 20s, and you shouldn't be living life like you're in your 20s, because it's doomed for failure. Look, I'm not in my 20s anymore, but certainly I can't get away with the things that I could in my 20s, and I'm only in my 30s. So add another 30 years on top of that, and things need to change. So if you're looking at prioritizing your health when you're over the age of 60, each little 10-year increment jump does modify your requirements, not only for energy but also for particular nutrients. And then commonly, as we start to get older, things start to break down, grey hairs start to appear, lines start to appear. So there are things associated with aging that diet as well as lifestyle can certainly modify, prevent and halt in some instances. So what do you think they are, Sean?
Got me there.
So in your 60s is a prime time for the development of certain chronic diseases. Big ones are heart disease, high cholesterol, diabetes, right? They're your top three, and they are certainly the top killers. Things like cancer as well is certainly one to be mindful of, but if you're doing as best you can, minimizing exposures to chemicals, if you're eating appropriately, if you're not gaining rapid amounts of weight, then really your risk of cancer is as low or as good as anybody else. So in your 60s, the goal really, from my perspective from a dietitian, is weight stability. As you get older, you generally start to gain weight, and that weight gain is likely more so body fat than it is muscle mass. So how can you modify that? Well, if you weren't a big mover in your 50s and 40s and 30s, then exercise becomes something that you really need to focus on doing, not only to maintain weight, but to maintain your muscle mass and try and slow that build or that gain of body fat. Not only that, your mobility and your ability to move will become impacted to a large extent the older you get if you aren't moving now. So if you're not a big runner, if you aren't going to find a new lease of life and start doing triathlons in your 60s, try and find something that you enjoy, that you actually will go and look to do for the most part at least a few times a week. So that's number one. Outside of that, focusing on energy intake is really, really fundamental to the prevention of weight gain. So if you are free of chronic disease, the goal is that you maintain a healthy body weight, and by doing that, you really need to assess your energy intake. If you've been putting on weight, I would try and look to reduce your snacking. That's probably the first and only tip that I can give you in a really vague sense of the word, is reduce your snacking. If you used to have lots of snacks, cut them back. You probably don't need any, maybe one a day, and if it's fruit, fine, but if it's anything else, I wouldn't be having them each day. As we get older, we hit our 70s. Whatever you've been doing for the last 10 years is probably fundamental to how the next 10 is going to go. So things that you can modify is certainly quality of nutrients and types of nutrients. The most particularly important over the age of 70 for anyone really is protein and calcium, and that's starting to kind of play into bone health and integrity. We know that it does make a difference, but we also know that the form it comes in, particularly in dairy, is really beneficial to health, particularly in the older generation. So if you have started to cut back foods, I would be trying to boost your intake of those foods and replace them for other things. If you start to find that your appetite starts to dwindle a little bit and you're cutting back your meal size, make sure you don't cut back the stuff that matters. So if at dinner you're cutting back the amount of vegetables that you're eating, don't do that. You maybe don't need to eat as much leading into dinner, or maybe you don't need to eat as much meat. Make sure that the veggies are still the priority. The other really important thing is focusing on fiber. Certainly fiber has a lot of nutritious components to it, but certainly a big one is around bowels. Regular bowel actions, regular movement, they can all make a big difference, but that's one key thing that does modify slightly in our 70s is our frequency of going. And you know that if you're going regularly, your eating is staying the same, your quantity and your quality is where it needs to be. Then when we get to our 80s, again, the emphasis is still on quality. Quality is most valuable because the quantity is certainly going to reduce. So if you find yourself not being able to get your 2 fruit in, your 5 veg, you're not having much dairy, you maybe only having a sandwich for lunch, not a salad sandwich with a bit of meat and cheese in it, again, go for quality versus quantity. So instead of cutting back on the things that on your meal size, maybe just cut back on your particular snacks. Maybe instead of having porridge for breakfast and it fills you up for 5 hours, maybe cut back that portion size to maybe a quarter of the size that you had, and then potentially look to have a yogurt mid-morning. Maybe with lunch you have a range of different foods, so it might be instead of a sandwich you have a piece of bread with something on it, you might have a piece of fruit, and then you might have again another yogurt or a glass of milk or something similar. So diversifying your meals and your snacks to ensure that you are getting the amount of nutrients that you need, particularly in the 80s and 80s plus, is really important. In terms of excesses, most of the time in the age of 80, weight tends to drop down, not increase further. So energy intake becomes less important and it becomes more fundamental that we focus on the quality. So if you're in your 80s, have a think about what you're eating. If it's not things that you were eating in 40s, 50s and 60s, it probably should. You know, if you're 80 now and you're growing up in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, and you probably need to consider that that's a good way of eating. So they're the best recommendations I can give you in the broad sense of the word. For anyone in the 60s, 70s and 80s, they all should be eating just a little bit different.